Chairman Schiff, John Bolton has now, in effect, testified. He's done it in television programs in promoting his book. And that's what Steve Schmidt was condemning him for, not coming forward to your inquiry and doing his constitutional duty and telling the truth about what he knew. And so when we look at the Republicans in the Senate blocking John Bolton from testifying when he finally said he was willing to testify, and from those same Republicans who blocked that testimony, we're not hearing a great deal of shock and surprise about what John Bolton has revealed. It does seem like the Republicans in the Senate believed that what John Bolton would say is what John Bolton is now publicly saying. And that's the reason they blocked his testimony. If John Bolton was allowed to testify in the Senate trial, do you believe it would have changed the course of history and changed the course of that Senate vote?
Well, I think, first of all, you're absolutely right. The senators who voted against hearing from John Bolton did so because they were afraid of what he would say. They knew they lacked the courage to vote to remove Donald Trump. Many of them had already found the evidence to be compelling, and it would be so much more difficult for them to justify, rationalize their vote to acquit Donald Trump if the country first heard from John Bolton. Indeed, when you look at Lamar Alexander, who I think has been more straightforward than most, he basically said, I didn't need to hear from John Bolton because I already believed Trump guilty. He was already proved by the House guilty. Why did we need another witness to just add on to what had already been proven? You know, even though people like Alexander should not have wanted to deprive the country of hearing about the president's guilt and anything else that John Bolton might have had to evaluate his fitness for office. How many other votes would have been affected? I don't know. I think the bigger risk for the president was not John Bolton's testimony alone, but the fact that John Bolton's testimony may have led to other witnesses and an unraveling of the Trump defense. That's what Mitch McConnell was most concerned about. But you're absolutely right. These senators were not trying to shield the country from John Bolton because they thought he would exonerate the president. Exactly the opposite.
And Chairman Schiff, I want to get your reaction to John Bolton basically criticizing you, criticizing Nancy Pelosi by saying that the impeachment inquiry in the House moved too fast and that you should have slowed down and worked through the court process to obtain his testimony.
Well, I would say a couple of things. First of all, Mr. Bolton has had a very difficult time rationalizing why he had vital information to share during the course of our impeachment investigation, and he refused, and he decided to save it for his book. That's a very hard thing to explain, and what he has tried to do is try to say now the House should have worked harder to find out that which John Bolton was keeping secret. In other words, we should have found people who were more courageous than John Bolton, who might have told us what John Bolton refused to. That's really a pretty flimsy defense of his own failings. And in every way, I think John Bolton condemns and indicts Donald Trump for doing things that were in his best interest, but not the national interest. He himself showed his own guilt of doing the same thing. But look, notwithstanding John Bolton's lack of patriotism and lack of courage, the allegations that he makes are very serious against the president. They are completely consistent with what we showed during the trial, and that is Donald Trump only makes decisions on the basis of what's good for him, not for the country. And that's how you can understand his comments about, I asked my people to slow down the testing. Obviously, deeply antagonistic to the health interests of the American people, but he felt it was politically advantageous.